Well, welcome to the Institute for Ethics and Public Life at SUNY Plattsburgh. I am Jonathan Slater. I am the director of the Ethics Institute, and I'm delighted to see everyone here today for this colloquy. Next week, before I introduce our honored guest, Professor Jose Torres, next week, a reminder about next week, our ordinary Wednesday colloquy will be moved to Thursday, the 14th of April at 2 p.m. to accommodate our very distinguished colloquy leader, an alumna of SUNY Plattsburgh and now teaching communication studies at Emerson University, and that is Dr. Sharifa Simon Roberts, a former student of mine, and she will actually be continuing this theme of talking about racial ideology, racist ideology, I should say. The moderators, I will not be the lone moderator. My esteemed colleague in communication studies here at SUNY Plattsburgh, Dr. Kirsten Isgro, will join me because Sharifa was also a student of Kirsten's. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And that will be at a different time than normal. That will be at 2 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, the 14th of April. So welcome everybody, and especially welcome Jose. It's really great to have you, and I'm so delighted you agreed to lead this colloquy today. I will try not to steal your thunder in this introduction, but I'll read what I have here. Roberto Clemente was the iconic Afro-Puerto Rican baseball Hall of Famer who died tragically on a humanitarian mission to aid the victims of an earthquake in Managua, Nicaragua. And in a new novella that you are working on right now, Jose, who had been he's retired now, had been a longtime member of our English faculty at SUNY Plattsburgh, is exploring racism from a Caribbean and Puerto Rican perspective. And rather than provide readers with a fictional biography, the novella takes us into Clemente's afterlife, if I understand correctly, which is actually very intriguing. So I can't wait for you to publish this book, Jose.
I hope it gets published.
It's essentially a voyage of discovery, self-awareness, and self-affirmation, particularly as these relate to Clemente's African ancestry. Jose approaches the Clemente story from a perspective of critical race theory, and therefore our conversation today will focus on issues of race, racism, and racist ideology. And he'll also examine the connection between colonialism and racism and draw our attention to the nuanced differences in the ways a Puerto Rican experiences racism in Puerto Rico, or an Afro Latinx person in their own country, as opposed to what happens into the US in general. Jose says that he's raising the prickly question of racism that many Latinx communities continue to confront. It would be remiss of me at this point if I do not highlight the fact that the Institute for Ethics in Public Life is a program of SUNY Plattsburgh, and we gain additional support from generous gifts to the Plattsburgh College Foundation. Jose, the virtual table is now yours. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to the Institute. 20 years at SUNY Plattsburgh, I never became a fellow. One of my few regrets. I wish I had every time that I wanted to. I didn't get it, just didn't have the time because I was doing other things. So I'm glad that I'm contributing somehow in my retirement to the Institute, which is a wonderful thing that we have at college. But also this opportunity gives me a chance to really talk about my book. Sometimes when you're immersed in a project, you're not only looking at the trees, you're really looking at the leaves. You get so wrapped up in it that sometimes you want to just step back and be able to, talk a little bit about what you're doing. So this gives me an opportunity. So thank you for that too. I think your introduction was really excellent. It sort of summarizes sort of my objective in writing this book. And, why Roberto Clemente? I mean, you give a good background to who he was. He was a great baseball player, but he also was a Hall of Famer. But he was also a humanitarian, and a person who, from my perspective, being Afro-Puerto Rican and coming to the United States, having to navigate those racial, waters, turbulent waters, especially in the 50s and 60s, what must have been like for him is the question that I was asking. Besides I worshipped him as a baseball player and as a Puerto Rican, I was always intrigued by how Puerto Ricans deal with race and racism, because anyone that knows the Caribbean and knows Latin America knows that there's obviously racism in Latin America and in Puerto Rico, but we do it differently. It's very different. And I think that has a lot to do with the historical background and agendas, imperialist agendas of both Spain and England, right? That's very important to note. But now being a colony of the United States that we are, and we still are, that we have sort of now have to deal with the kind of racism that is prevalent in the United States. Roberto comes from the island to play baseball, and he is somewhat quite shocked, that is so blatant. And certainly for all the things that happen to Afro-Puerto Ricans or dark-complected Puerto Ricans in the island, he would never have seen a cross burning in Puerto Rico. He would never have seen a lynching in Puerto Rico. So there's different grades of the types of racism that are out there. But there's still racism, and the form in Puerto Rico is somewhat insidious. It's the kind of subtle kind that sometimes you think, we like to think that we aren't as racist. That's something, in Puerto Rico, they like to say, yeah, that's like over there. We're not, we get really bothered that people even say that we're racist. How can we be racist? My grandmother is Black. So, but that's the way racism really works. It operates at different levels. And sometimes we don't even see it, and we're not even really aware that it's working until something disruptive happens, right? So my attempt was to have him be my protagonist in this journey in the afterlife, because everything that probably could be written about Roberto in his real life has been done, including, if anybody wants to read the definitive biography on Roberto Clemente, read David Morales' book on it. In fact, I have it right here. It's an excellent book. And it's titled Clemente, the Passion and Grace of Baseball as Hero. Fabulous biography, which I read also in preparation for this. So he's in the afterlife, and he is now meeting all these illustrious Afro-Puerto Ricans that in this journey he will have conversations with and begin to learn more about African Puerto Ricans, Afro-Puerto Ricans, history, sort of what does that entail to be a person who is of Black ancestry in Puerto Rico. And some of them are really amazing historical figures. I had to do research in this. We have somebody like Arturo Schomburg, who becomes his mentor and his guide through this journey towards self-realization, actualization, and affirmation of his Black identity. And I don't know how many people know about Arturo Schomburg. Arturo Schomburg is really very important also, and I think Tracy would agree with me that he was sort of the encyclopedia and library for a lot of the writers in the African Renaissance and African Harlem Renaissance. And some people don't even know this man exists, including Puerto Ricans who, you ask them, do you know who Schomburg is? And who, what? They don't know. And there's a library in Harlem named after him. So he's going to be his guide through the steps, and he becomes sort of the historical voice that sometimes interjects things, to kind of give context to things. as he's talking to all these other Afro-Puerto Ricans. We have somebody like Miguel Enriquez, who was at one time he was a privateer during the 18th century, when privateers were a big thing. And he was, privateers are basically what we call pirates that go out, they're sort of independent workers, they're contracted by the crown, whichever may be, to go out there and, sort of take over other ships, basically, and their contraband. The interesting thing about Miguel Enriquez was that he was probably the richest person in Latin America at one period. And he was biracial. It's alleged that his father was someone of the clergy, and white, and who never recognized him, as the son. But he also always had help from the clergy in Puerto Rico, so he probably was high up in the hierarchy. And so here's a person that also is a slave owner. So as a writer, a fictional writer, I was fascinated by this story already. So I said, this is going to make a very good, what I call episodes. I'm not calling them chapters, I'm calling them episodes. So this is the first episode that, and Roberto Clemente meets this individual and has his conversations with him. And then he moves on to Jose Celso Barbosa, who is in Puerto Rican history. He's considered the father of the statehood movement, one of the first persons of African ancestry to get a medical degree from the University of Michigan. Comes back to Puerto Rico. They wouldn't even let him practice in Puerto Rico because, basically everybody running the show there, the medical boards and everything, were white Spaniards or, or white Cubans from the University of Havana. So he had a hard time just getting people to accept his degree from the University of Michigan, right, in Puerto Rico. And yet this man was very pro-American. He ultimately wanted Puerto Rico to become part of the US. And imagine the conflict and the conversation they're having, which I've already written, but about how, what point, the question to him is, how can you want to be part of a country that has such a racist history? And of course, that's dealt with in the episode. And then we go to Celestina Cordero, who many people forget about her because her brother, Rafael Cordero, was sort of considered the founder of public education in Puerto Rico. But what they don't know is that his sister taught him everything. His sister, Celestina, was the one that actually taught him how to read, along with his mother, taught him a lot, math and arithmetic and all that other stuff. And she was older, and she's almost forgotten in the history books. And as I'm beginning to write this and include, who am I going to include in this book as illustrious Afro-Puerto? I'm going to include her because her story is not told. And so imagine her being now Afro-Puerto Rican woman. Her brother had enough issues and problems with that. Imagine her, and she was the one that actually went out and got the school money through him, and she had certified. She was the one that constantly went to the people in charge of education in Puerto Rico and then the Spanish government, and fought for that. And her brother gets all the credit, which is really sad. So I think that's unfair, and we're going to bring Celestina into the conversation with it. But one of the things too, as I'm doing, each one of these persons kind of represents a different sector. So I'm also utilizing that. So in this one of education, she's trying to get him to see things, try to break away from what you think you see, which is very important. And then in the episode, he goes, the sort of events through memories that he goes back to. And one of the encounters is him now realizing, as he's seen himself, looking at himself as a young teenager, the racism that he was facing, he didn't realize it was racist, you see. So, or Jose Celso Barbosa trying to straighten him out and says, what is the biology of racism? Let's explain, I'll explain it to you, right? What is this melanin thing, right? So that kind of thing. And then in the episode after Celestina, we talked, I mentioned, I think I include Juan Hernandez. A lot of people don't know about Juan Hernandez. I love this project because I'm learning so much myself, all right? I did not even know these people existed, all right? As a Puerto Rican, I'm embarrassed to say that. Juan Hernandez, even before Sidney Poitier, was an early African, sort of a person of African ancestry that was in early pictures. He was in silent movies, and then he was in what we call race films. He was involved in that. Maybe Tracy would know the director, the famous director that was that was African, who was doing these films. He worked with him. And he actually did work with Sidney Poitier. And of course, this episode is all, it takes place in a theater, movie theater, of course. And because in this outer world, what's most important is memories. And these people live in their memories. So this memory of this theater for him is very important as an actor and a person in film. And of course, the discussion is going to center about representation and how he's represented. Because, Roberto Clemente had a lot of problems with the media. They just did not understand him, or how they understand him, how they wanted to portray him was not the way he felt he was. And I'll just give you a quick example. He was constantly quoted phonetically the way he was talking. And of course, that's racist, because he would also know. I mean, Roberto knew. So why is it when they clean up the grammar of the white guys from the South and Appalachia, they seem to clean up their language. In mine, they leave it the way it is. Now, why is that, and all kinds of things, that he was lazy. He could have been, more driven, he was a slacker. I mean, all these kinds of racist things of a man that, gave 100% if you watched him play. But this is the media representation of him. So a lot of that conversation is about how the media represents Black people. So that's, I think those are the 5 that I have so far, and I'm 5 out of 9 episodes. So that really is a long way to summarize the novella, to tell you what I'm trying to do. But as Jonathan said, the focus really is race and racism. I've always been fascinated by the subject, and thinking about this. I actually thought Jonathan back to Vassar, because Jonathan and I both went to Vassar College at the same time, right? And I can't believe we never met. Of course, I don't know, maybe you saw a guy with a big fro. If you remember anybody,
well, no, we were 2 years apart, but we were on the campus at the same time, and it's one of those revelations, and
here we are, right?
And here we are. We went to the same college, and we teaching
now,
at the same college.
At Vassar, was one of my majors was Spanish, so I had to do a BA thesis. And I was just thinking about this. I picked something that it says a lot. I mean, my topic was on Luis Pales Matos. I don't know if anybody knows who Luis Pales Matos is. He's an Afro-Antillean poet, in the school of negritude school, of poetry, where they were trying to sort of mimic, rhythms in, African rhythms, what they thought were African rhythms, and also integrate the culture. Now, this was a project on his part to try to say, I'm embracing, my African ancestry, because he lived in Guayama, which is a port city, and the port cities in Puerto Rico, like many other Latin American countries, where probably a lot of the Black populations were, and Guayama is known for that. So he wanted to, and he was from there, so he wanted to do that poetry, that kind of poetry. And so I was fascinated, because why is it? And this, you look at a picture of him, he's very, he's white looking, he's white complected. And I said, I find it fascinating that this is an attempt to try to sort of integrate that more, actively into our cultural discourse as Puerto Ricans. So even back then, when I was in my 20s, I was fascinated by this issue and this topic. So I wrote my thesis on that, sort of defending it and sort of saying that, and of course, interesting in the process of this book, of writing this book and project, it's been a learning process for me too. And I came across this text by Isabelo Señón Cruz, who's an Afro-Puerto Rican scholar that wrote this book. And the title was Narciso Descubre su Trasero, which roughly translated is Narcissus discovers his behind. Which is the book having to do with Afro-Puerto Rican culture and Afro-Puerto Rican representation in poetry specifically. You can see the sarcasm in that, and also the idea of the racist kind of reversal he does with that, right? If Narcissus were Black, he would not be looking at himself, he'd be looking at his behind, because that's what people are looking at, right? In terms of, racist kind of commentary about the Black body. So that book was published in 1972, just when I had started at Vassar. And here I am 4 years later writing this book, and I didn't even know that book existed, right? And that has a lot to say also about my separation as what I call a diasporican, being a Puerto Rican diaspora, growing up here, that I'm disconnected. Here I'm writing a book on Luis Pales Matos that I just came across because he is a famous poet, Mosa. And as I'm taking poetry courses, I'm loving Latin American poetry. And I'm like, this is fantastic. And I wanted to do something in Puerto Rico. I had no clue that this man, this Afro-Puerto Rican, living at the same period, had published this book in 1972. Fabulous book, seminal book, in my opinion. And I read it just recently, okay? It goes to show you. So in that book, he really breaks down. He was doing critical race theory from a Puerto Rican perspective way before critical race theory. He talks about the biological, issues there, and he breaks it just down to break down this ideology that's out there that is so wrapped up really in white supremacist ideas, and that's basically it. So I was always interested and intrigued by the issue. So it would not down the line, and Tracy knows I wrote a designer course in race and whiteness to teach, because I think that college students should know about these issues. And of course, speaking of critical race theory, which I have incorporated ideas and sort of into this work, because why? It gives you a fabulous critical framework to look at race. For the first time in my life, always interested in this topic, I was always doing it from the other way around. I'm always looking at the Black figure, because that is the white gaze. And I was learning how to do the white gaze. And now we've reversed the microscope and we're looking at white folks and saying, wait a minute, how did we come about this racism and these ideas and racist ideology? How do we do that? Is the solution to finding the answer to that question looking at Black people? If white people invented this, shouldn't we be looking at white people and how they came about these ideas and what? So that's what we're doing. And you can understand, I'm sure everyone here knows the controversial critical race theory. Jonathan, remember when we were in that committee in social justice?
I was just going to mention that you served on the social justice task force, President Ettling's social justice task force here at SUNY Plattsburgh 2018, and you've not only been educating students, you educated that task force. You gave us you gave us a lot of grounding in critical race theory, which I appreciate to this day, and it really helped to frame not only our deliberations in that task force, but it framed the report, that 20 recommendation report to President Ettling. So I am eternally grateful to your intervention in that task force.
I'm grateful that I came across it, and it's only really about 30 years old, really, or maybe even 40. Derek Bell had a lot to do with it at Harvard Law School, first African American, right? You have to be in the room. I do believe that. If you're not in the room, you're never going to really get anything moving. And he started this, because he was the discrepancies in the legal system are just shocking when you really look at them. Look at the data, and you begin, why is it that consistently, over case after case after case after case, Black defendants are given different sentences, for the same crime, the same charge? Why is that? You should be getting more or less the same, right? No, but it's consistent higher, more years, more time. Sometimes not even, you can't even be paroled. It's like, this is something that's very serious. And you take that framework and you take it to literature, which I have, and now it gives the students or anybody really looking at a text it's a valuable tool. You can start framing things in a different way and reading into things differently, just like feminist theory did for literature, or any different that takes any theory that gives a different perspective. So that's where I'm at now. Obviously the framework is critical race theory, and how to incorporate those ideas into the text has been very helpful for me writing this book. And also the novella, I have to just mention quickly the novella, and I want to start having conversation. But the novella is something that I automatically knew I had to I gravitated to it because I said, one of the things that I wanted to structure in this book is really, if we're talking about the afterlife, at what point, he's dying, and I begin each episode with sort of what we call life review experience, life review phenomenon. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's the so-called your life flashing before your eyes. So all the epigraphs are sort of these moments as he's dying, and they're moments in his life, but they become an opening for the episode to start deal with that part of his life, right? And so this book could not be 400, 500 pages. There's no way, right? I mean, I'm taking something that might take maybe, I don't know, 30, 40 seconds, before you expire, and developing it into a book length project. I think people will get a little tired of reading this guy in the afterlife. Because the purpose too of it, if there were an afterlife like this, right? This is just a trope I'm using. I'm not saying that there is such a place or not. And those of you that know me probably know I don't believe that there is. But as a fictional device, it's interesting. It's not new, but that if he's in the afterlife, what is the purpose of his being here? And how does it end? Because I have to end this book somewhere. So I'm still working on that. But I just thought there had to be a novella. And then I always do this when I was teaching anyway. If I have a particular writing project, I also like to include my students in it. And it helps me because as I'm teaching something, it helps me learn also myself. And so I put together a course on the novella right before I left. And it was a wonderful course because I learned a lot about the novella. And it's helped me now write it. And I know that I'm going in the right direction. The novella is the genre for this particular book. There's no doubt in my mind for a lot of reasons. And if anybody wants to ask me questions about that, they can, but that's another thing. And the last thing I want to say is just that I've really grown. I think writing in general is an attempt to answer questions and resolve issues in many ways. We try to work it out as we write it, right? And for me, this has been a personal journey too. And I don't see Roberto Clemente's journey in this book as an isolated thing. It's a journey that I'm going with, on with him. And I always say this, I write for a bifurcated audience. I don't just write for a mainstream, American. I write for Puerto Ricans also. I'm writing for them because I think that I'm one voice, a few of us that write about the Puerto Rican diaspora experience. And I want to write this for them to also take the journey, but also as all Americans that, and this is maybe the segue into the knowledge conversation. How do we deal with this issue? I think Americans have to start looking. If they read this book, anyone reads this book who really is open-minded and wants to really learn about how racism operates and how it affects different people. As a person of the Puerto Rican diaspora that had to leave my country, it's been a colony for 224 years, the oldest colony on earth. Not a great moniker, not something that we can be proud of, right? But that's the case. And colonialism has a lot to do with racism. I mean, think about how racism in the European world came about and how connected it was to slavery and how connected to colonizing people and taking their resources and all of that. You cannot separate them. So we as colonial people are now confronted with dealing with our racism as a Latin American country, and at the same time dealing with this really virulent type of racism that's European based, and well, so is the Spanish one, right? But and we can get into discussions as why it's a little bit different. Spain is somewhat different, not any better, but different, in how they dealt with people of color, mainly because the Moors took over for 800 years. But that's a whole different thing, and they had to deal with the Moors. But it's been a personal growth for me, this book, not only learning more about Puerto Rican, so every writer learns a lot from this, but I've learned a tremendous amount. So this is a book that I'm very appreciative that I'm doing.
Well, Jose, this is an exciting project. As I said, I just can't wait to read this book. And let's open it up to questions and comments, observations by those in attendance. Just go ahead. We're a small enough group that just jump in and yeah. So if you have something to say. Athena, you put something in the chat. Why don't you go ahead and share that? No. Okay.
Please, please.
Go ahead, please.
I'm begging you.
Come
on, Athena.
Oh my God, I hate public speaking.
This isn't public. This is pixels. This is pixels on the screen. It's not public.
It's virtual.
Well,
It's very forgiving. It's very forgiving.
I love the premise because it allows you to access all of these important individuals. And I understand what you're saying as a Puerto Rican, that you're going on the journey to affirm that Black identity that's within you. So like that, I think is also, that makes a lot of sense. And it's so interesting to me also that you said you're still working on it. Like, are you still selecting individuals? Or have you got everyone figured out and the episodes just kind of sketched out and not fully formed? Like, can you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure, I'll be more than happy to. Yeah, my method is always I plan a lot before I even take on the writing, and so I have it already figured out. It's this is the one, and then this was the fifth, and for the sixth, I'm dealing three Afro Puerto Ricans, Julia de Burgos, that just recently I realized she was Black or had some Black ancestry. You know what I'm saying? Famous poet, and Jose Campeche, who is one of the biggest exponents of Rococo painting in Latin America. A lot of people don't even know who he is. Famous Afro, he was biracial. And also Rafael Hernandez, who is also one of the great Latin American composers. He composed Cumbachero, which everybody probably knows if they know anything about music, along with other Preciosa, which is the famous song that you mentioned. So those three people are going to be talking from sort of artistic perspective. I'm going to have a lot of fun with this because I can see these folks being artists, they're visionaries, of course. So they're the three people who could actually see into the future. So I'm going to incorporate a lot of future things from them and be able to have them maybe even dress differently. They're going to be dressed more modern. And they're going to be really dealing with the issue of, artistic representation and what does it mean to be an artist and be, of color, Afro-Puerto Rican. And then down the line, he's going to meet Pedro Albizu Campos. And I have him in that particular episode talk to Martin Luther King, which he did. He actually met Martin Luther King and invited him to his Carolina finca, to have a conversation. Yeah. So I'm going to put them in that room and I'm going to write it the way I think maybe it went down. This was a moment, I think, when Martin Luther King was becoming more politicized and more activist and more left-leaning. I think he was beginning to see that it was more about poverty and how poor people are treated that goes beyond race. And that was a big moment for him before they assassinated him. But so that's, and then the last was 5, 6, 7, 8. Maybe I'm missing one of them there, but it's all planned, is what I'm saying. And then the ninth chapter episode is going to be, I don't know yet. I haven't really I'm going to give it that sort of Flannery O'Connor thing that maybe I'll find it when I'm finally finishing it and writing it. But it is planned. I definitely have all the people figured out, and I'm leaving somebody, I'm sure, but I can't remember.
I know. More. Yeah. The reason that I said exactly like the double after consciousness is true that I think it brings to the front that experiencing racism that can shatter you like on a soul level, like it stays with you. And maybe like the more romantic takeaway, there's nothing giantly intellectual about that. But I think it's, that's also what hits me about that particular, I don't know if it's a premise or a trope or the fact that it's taking place in the afterlife, that space.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the thing is that sometimes we go through our lives not really understanding things. And in his case, definitely, he was 38 years old. And he had experienced that, but he didn't have he didn't have critical race theory. He's trying to figure out how the heck. I mean, it's like, in Puerto Rico, maybe he had some, and I'm sure he actually said, I never really experienced it. And I'm like, that's the one thing that hit me when I read that quote. I said, Roberto, you never really experienced racism in Puerto Rico? I mean, I don't know. I've seen it in Puerto Rico, So yeah, and it's really rough when you are a multiracial, I'm multiracial. And what does that mean for me, right? This is a journey we'll have to take. What does it mean for me as a multiracial person living in a country that has deep foundations in racism? I mean, when you have white men, mostly straight men, I don't know if they're anywhere gay, but, basically writing a constitution for a country, and some of them are slave owners. That's beyond ironic. It's just strange. So this is the country that's taken over mine and is now basically feeding us daily as Puerto Ricans, this kind of racism, and to the point that you can see, I've met really dark complected Puerto Ricans push the Spanish on you. Like they want to make it clear that I can speak Spanish because I don't want you to think I'm African American, i.e. I'm not black. And you're looking at them and they're as black as my sweater, right? I mean, it's like, dude, there's something wrong there. I mean, and again, you also have to understand your subject position, right? Athena, I mean, it's like, if you're right, light complected, I am, but that makes it easier for me in this country, right? And then how do you navigate that as a person that comes from a country that we all, at least in our cultural kind of mindset, understand that all of us have a little, what we call tajita, a little slice, or that we, there's a famous poem that was, I forget the name of the writer, Viscarondo, I think it is, who it's basically about somebody denying that they're have black, and they keep their grandmother hidden away. And the poem is, ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? Where's your grandmother? Sort of like the poet is asking the speaker, you keep all these airs that you go about trying to be white. So that's a very interesting cultural space. What kind of American does that? Unless maybe you're African American community, you're questioning, somebody trying to pass. But in Puerto Rico, this idea of passing is also weird. It's like, it's a very strange way that we deal with racism, is what I'm trying to say. So, but we're part of the US. We're integrated into this country many years now. And so how do we negotiate those things? It's really the key that I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to figure out answers for myself.
Other comments? Tracy, you look like you wanted to contribute something. You've been actively engaged. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
I'm just nodding my head a lot. Is more and missing Jose being a partner in doing this on campus. He left before it got really bad because we both taught a class together that we designed together years and years ago, and I'm teaching it this semester, and it's like a Twilight Zone experience. It's just so out of the world. I mean, it's like we've gone back 30 years in terms of conversations about race and ethnicity and whiteness. And it's just been a matter of, a couple years since I taught this class. And I think it's, this reaction to the terminology, critical race theory, has made people incredibly vocal against it, who I had not heard be so vocal against it in the past. And even having today, we talked about Irish immigrants in the class and how the Irish became white. How when they first came, they were coded as racialized, and everyone I showed them images, comparing African Americans to the forehead slope of the Irish immigrant, and they just like, well, but they're white. It's just like,
Missing the point.
that's a construction. And clearly for a while they were not constructed that way. And they made the decision to construct themselves that way. And they did everything they could to drop off as much as possible those things that made them different. And the thing they embraced was whiteness. They gave up class, they gave up religion, you know, at least appearance wise, in order to get that political power. And they just, you know, I'm not even like making it up. It's in a book that's now 25 years old that I'm using, a textbook. And yet I'm getting incredible resistance. And I've always had a little bit in this class, but nothing to this extreme. So it's fun.
Tracy, but resistance from the students, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
understandable, right? That's why we're trying to see now from, you know, from the right, you know, wing factions in this country, we're trying to, you know, brainwash them according to them. And so we're basically giving them, you know, material that has been thought seriously by scholars who take what they're, you know, saying seriously and critically before they present it. And the evidence is pretty strong. I mean, and you're right, because whiteness itself is a construction, right? I mean, you know, I tell a lot of people sometimes, you know, whiteness was an invention that Europeans came up with, you know, here, where before nobody in Europe says, I'm white. You know, when they came here, all of a sudden that became important beyond I'm French or I'm Belgian, you know, Dutch or English. You know, I mean, all of a sudden you become white because there's these others, right? So we have to band together. And sort of, I mean, I always tell people, man, if you don't read about the Bacon Rebellion, I mean, that to me,
it's actually where we begin.
Yeah, I mean, that's the roots. And when you read that, and this is history, this this thing happened, right? And when you look at what happened in the Bacon Rebellion, and you have actually African ancestry, you know, people who African ancestry here working with white people, a lot of them Irish, against the powers that be. And interesting enough, they were really upset with the Native Americans, because they were controlling the fur market, you know, and so all these coalitions, but you know, black people working with white people against the powers that be. Oh my goodness, we don't want that. We can't have that. And of course, they were smashed. But all of a sudden, after that, you get more draconian kind of laws passed against black people. And we got to build a wedge under, you know, we got to build this wedge between these white working class, whatever people, blacks, you know, and then that led the road to more slave laws. You know, they were even more like, you know, really evil. Is the only way I can say. Yeah.
Thanks. Sarah, you have something to contribute.
Well, yes. I have this program now that I watch faithfully. It's called The Cross Connection. And I'm sure you know about it. And the Cross Connection made a comment that Ketanji, her color played a role in the hesitation of many to vote for her. And I thought, you know, the darkness of her skin was something that was important. The other comment I wanted to make is the culture, I call it, and my granddaughter called it, the culture of hiding. And she happened to be a Fulbright Fellow in Germany for a year. And the culture of hiding, and you mentioned passing, she called it hiding, but it is a lot on color. It is, but it's from the Middle East. It's people who have emigrated from the Middle East, found themselves in Germany. And it struck her because she was hiding too, in that she was Jewish and they were all Palestinian or from other Middle Eastern countries. And it just struck me that there are so many areas where your work and the work of others like you is so important.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah, I think anytime that you're entering a hegemonic kind of dominant culture, if it was a very open culture, we wouldn't have to hide. but the hiding is at all levels. I mean, remember, gay people were in the closet. They were hiding, right, at one point, until they were able to be open, right? And that's the issue, that we're dealing with forces that anytime that we become more open, they want to put people back in the closet. They want to put them back in hiding because they don't want to look at you. They don't want to see you. And that's their issue. This is not the issue of the people who are being, have to force to hide who they are, whether they be Palestinian, Muslim, Puerto Rican, whatever, right? That's the goal, I think, is to open up our society more. If we're a democracy, we have to eliminate these very vicious ideologies. So on one level, you deal with representation, you deal with issues of how we see the world, and then also work on the pragmatic parts of it, the laws, the politics and stuff. Yeah, thank you.
So, yeah, Jose, I had a couple of observations about critical race theory that I just wanted to share with you and everyone attending. I think that when we sort of cast aside all of the rhetoric that's flying about critical race theory, I think from and you said it yourself that it's a scholarly instrument. It's a tool for us to approaching. And I'm reading Sherry Turkle's Empathy Diaries right now. And she makes this point about how good theories are ways of casting light on events, and events are good ways of casting light on useful theories. And I think that critical race theory is a really good example of that you can use critical race theory to shed light on events and broaden your understanding of those events. And it's also a good way to take events and look at those events through a different type of prism.
Right.
But I find it intriguing also that you're using this metaphor for the afterlife as a way of bringing critical race theory into this novella of yours, and because racist ideology, racism itself exists because, and you said it in other terms today, that it's invisible, that because it's so normative and it's so normal and it's regular and it's accepted, it's invisible and becomes, in essence, it becomes the culture. It doesn't become part of the culture, it becomes the culture, Edward Hall, the anthropologist, said, culture is not like a coat that you can take on and put off. This use of the afterlife, in a way, is like critical race theory, if you think about it, because the afterlife affords you an immunity from this normative environment. That is, it frees you up and it allows you to rise above, literally and metaphysically,
Yes.
to rise above the scene below. And
Right.
I think this is brilliant, and I think that's perhaps part of this reaction, this overreaction to critical race theory, is because it is so revelatory.
Yeah.
It's frightening to so many people who see it eroding this normal culture of theirs. It casts a light. So.
You know what? It really is pulling the bandage off the scab, with force. That's really what it is. You know what I mean? Go ahead.
Can I just offer a more cynical view? I don't know if we can get more cynical, but I don't think that most of the people complaining about critical race theory have a clue in hell about what it actually says.
No,
it's just, I think that if we're going to look at how parties and factions in the United States operate, the Democrats are not very good about slogans. So
terrible.
someone saw the words critical and race together and just came across it in some Wikipedia article and said, oh my God, I'm picking up that as a Republican, and I'm going to force it down the throat of every suburban mom and say this is a horrible thing. I
Yeah.
mean, Republicans have the most innocuous sounding names for the worst groups of people there are. We're
Yeah.
just really bad at giving names. And so it sounds bad. Just keep, pushing that advertising that this is something horrible.
That's, well, we know that the conservative forces here really depend on fear. It's fear, Now they're brainwashing my kid, as if kindergartens can understand critical race theory. I mean, there's, there's graduate students that can understand critical race theory. I mean, it's deep. It really goes into a lot of things, and it's interdisciplinary, obviously. But and you're right, Tracy. I think in the political sphere, Democrats are really horrible at messaging. And the thing is, too, I don't know what they're waiting for. I mean, they're under attack with these. They're very good at this, the Republicans. They take something and they go right to the nerve. I mean, they're brainwashing your kids. And so now I want control of my kids' education, as if you are somehow who's controlling. And all these leftists, they wanted all this stuff that they're all this boogeyman that they afraid of, and that has results, unfortunately. But critical race theory really is what you said, Jonathan. Is really, and I said really, it's like you take this guy and it hurts. It hurts when you look at it, and but there's no other way to deal with the truth. I came across a really wonderful quote that is attributed to Antonio Gramsci. I don't know if anybody has read him, the prison book, Notebooks, and it's something like the condition for truth is suffering, or allowing the suffering to speak. Right? I mean, the condition for truth. We cannot have truth unless we have or allow people who suffer or the suffering to speak. And so now we're having the suffering speak, and people are not liking what they're hearing. This is the issue. And the more you delve into this, because again, if I am being introduced to this and I'm going deeper into this and I find things are really uglier and uglier and uglier. I never knew about Tulsa. Tracy, I did not know about Tulsa until about 2 years ago. I know. I'm wow. So again, and why is that particular, and why I'm bringing that up? Because one of the things that we have in that critical race theory attacks is this idea of meritocracy. Oh, if you're just good, you work hard, you can do this and whatever. Okay, so you have all these African Americans who have exceeded, depending what the blocks put upon them. You have a neighborhood in Tulsa that is really middle class and upper middle class. I mean, amazing what these, you have, people who are professionals, dentists, doctors, all this stuff. And that must not have been like really something acceptable to some white people in Tulsa, that they found a way to always justify going in there and burning this neighborhood to the ground. And then on top of it, throwing a bomb on it. Now that kind of white hysteria, because that's all you can call it, is something that we see. And that's not only, if it was just this isolated case, several other cases, 6, 7 maybe, as you dig deeper into, and you go, oh my God, how can this happen, right?
But Jose, if I can interrupt, you're talking about this. It's almost a form of amnesia that's forced on you.
Yes,
because but this is
Yeah.
part of American culture in general. It's not just involving things that are racial and racist. It tends to be that there's this erasure of the past, and we see this. For example, in the mythic accounts of the Alamo, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And in my public relations classes, I teach about the Ludlow massacre in Colorado, where John D. Rockefeller orders the Pinkertons to break up a strike, and men, women, and children are killed, and it takes 100 years for a memorial plaque to go up at the site of the mine.
Right.
I
agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
what I'm saying is that,
it's an amnesia that doesn't come from within, but
right.
it's imposed by the culture without.
And this is why critical race theory now, what it's saying, it says those are the things that we have to study and teach, right? And not only that, but I mean, class is something that's completely almost out of the history books here. Nobody wants to talk about class, right? And it's a very important element, right? And so, you know, sort of the three things that we, you know, gender, class, race, you know, class seems to always be left out. And so that incident that you mentioned, yeah, and what was the other? There was a movie made about also mine workers. You know, sometimes it filters up.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that?
Managua.
Right.
Rosewood.
Managua, right? Was it Managua?
Yeah, Managua. Yeah.
Right. And so again, what critical theory now proposes is that we have to start looking at things differently, and also, why don't we teach that history? And some people really get upset because it goes against their cognitive, you know, it's like cognitive dissonance. No, that's not the way it happened. I learned in high school, you know, this kind of thing. So I think we're challenging that. And because we're challenging it, people feel very uncomfortable. This is the thing. There's a lot of discomfort, not only talking about race and horrific things done in terms of racism, but as Jonathan said, this, you know, just killing workers because they're going against the system, and someone having the power to do that is something that also has to be looked at. And do we want to build a better America? Really, what is this project? Are we still, or are we going to just continue living with the lies? You know, it doesn't mean that you don't have faith in the country, but you have less faith if we don't face up to the facts and reality. There's no way. We cannot continue building this country and nation based on lies. You know, it's just not going to work. Sooner or later, it's going to come back to haunt you, because it's already doing it, right? It's already happened.
Tom, you wanted to interject something at this point? Unmute yourself.
No, I didn't. I was going to mention Managua while you were struggling for it. And I think there was a movie called Rosewood too. And I was going to point that out.
Right.
Look, since I've got the floor, this has been
Take it.
a rich presentation, and you have given us a metaphor for understanding critical race theory that is simple enough so that it enables us to get at what is making it so discomforting for the culture. And that is that it has reversed the lens.
Yes.
Instead of looking at the experience of Black Americans, it's looking at the views of white Americans and making that the critical focus of analysis. And I found it enormously useful, having read a great deal about this for years. That perhaps is the single clearest metaphor for understanding the tumult that it has created. Yeah.
Well, you know, and there's other examples of that in history. I used to always tell my students to understand the differences, you know, and the perspective is, you know, why, for instance, I said, if dealing with feminist issues, right, and contraception, why is it that almost all the contraceptives are geared to women, when if biologists will tell you the reproductive system of a male is so much simpler than women's? There's so many things to deal with. Why do you think that is? I would tell my students and ask my students. And there's always a smart student who say, well, mostly men are probably the doctors, right? I says, yeah, the male gaze might have something to do with it, don't you think? Because if women are probably in charge, they would go, why does it have to be us? You know, I mean, this idea, well, women are the ones that have the baby, you know, can have the baby. I says, yeah, but we're trying to prevent that. So if it's trying to prevent it, then maybe vasectomies, which are easier to do, but no man is going to want to be their body being, you know. So that's just one way of looking at things, and you're right.
But you know, you're in a way you're skirting another metaphor here, really, because if you look at the objections to critical race theory, yes, it's coming from a certain segment of the white population, but it's also coming from mostly men, although there are some women who have been very vocal about this too. But could you, using that vasectomy issue. No, really, because
No,
I
no,
mean
you're right.
the objections
Yes.
to vasectomy have you know, sort of these very deep unconscious concerns about emasculation.
Yes.
And you can make the case that the white male is fearful of critical race theory because, again, unconsciously, it's seen as a form of emasculation.
Well, but it's also a loss of power. Let's
Wow.
not forget about power. We're
Same
talking about
thing.
power
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't, and Tracy, maybe you can help me out. I know there's a book that it's on my reading list, but it's about sort of American, you know, culture being a caste system. I forget. I have it in my bookshelf back there. And, you know, we never think of that here. We think that, you know, sort of third world countries have caste systems, but, you know, let's face it, at the top of this caste system here is the white heterosexual men, right? And if you're trying to look back at the history of this country in terms of, you know, we can look at the wonderful things that it's done. All right? I'm not going to be a complete, I mean, there's things that we can all be, there's things in America that we can go, okay. But in terms of the flaws of the country, you cannot get all the good things and not be criticized for the bad things. And so who has been in charge for the most part creating this? This has been white men, right? So we start looking at history and looking at the flaws and how this has come to be. At the center of that, we inevitably find white men who have been in power. So now we're starting to question, and this is why, you know, I mean, this is fascinating, Jonathan, to me, because I think that there's so much, talk about white fragility, there's a lot of male fragility in this country when it comes to a lot of these issues. And I never heard, until recently, I've heard about incels, you know, these men who are involuntary. And I'm like, these are some of the most misogynist. And my son, for instance, a while goes and read it, and he goes all these into this. Dad, you got these. It's really weird, man. These people are really, these men are really, they're like blaming women because they can't seem to have sex.
Yeah, Jose.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what is going on with this? And no, we can laugh, but, you know, one recent in Georgia, remember Georgia? This person had all kinds of things, you know, he's involved in all kinds of incidents, you know. He shot 6 women in Georgia. I mean, this is getting really,
Yeah.
So this fragility is at the core of a lot of these issues also, because white men in America, for the most part, have been in power. And they like the power and they like to be in power. And now they're being challenged by even being questioned as to, you know, what have you done with that power? And I think that that's, you know, maybe subconsciously something that don't like being looked at, right? And it's okay for them to look at other people and go, but when they start to get looked at, it's very uncomfortable. It's almost like we have made them naked and nude, and now we're looking at them and they're not liking it.
Jose, it sounds like we could spend hours more talking about this. This has been, I mean, I am just so excited about the passion that you are bringing to this project and to the subject. And I think we all here today wish you tremendous success on this novella, and I look forward to reading it when it's complete and published. Keep in mind that next week our colloquy will be on Thursday at 2 p.m. with Dr. Sharifa Simon Roberts from Emerson University. And thank you for being here today. Thank you, Jose. It's been wonderful. It has been engaging. It has been educational, instructive, and I mean, I always get excited about these colloquies, but today I really feel particularly emotional about it because you brought such passion to it. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.